Now, our next panel is going to be very interesting. The industries located along the shores of the Great Lakes are clearly key and important partners in cleaning up and revitalizing areas of concern. These are been referred to frequently as the toxic hotspots that have been designated under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And as we've heard today and in other briefings, restoring these areas are a really wise investment that not only will protect the environment, but help revitalize areas as engines for growth. The interest in brownfields, for example, throughout the region is very significant and very important. Now, there's a new publication. It's entitled, that we did with EPA, called Revitalizing Local Waterfront Economies, Investing in the Great Lakes. It's pretty, it's also substantive, and very useful. And the Great Lakes Legacy Act, as you know, is our primary tool for cleaning up contaminated sediments within the Great Lakes Basin. Using this successful federal program in our region, we've invested nearly $300 million to clean up more than 1.3 million cubic yards of contaminated sediments. This amount of money that was spent, almost half of that, about $120 million, was provided by non-federal sponsors, and half of that came from 34 different industries. The industries are clearly partners in this whole effort. Now, recognizing the important and growing role of Great Lakes industries, and we heard from George Cooper yesterday about his ideas and concerns, we've invited two individuals with deep experience to discuss how business can support cleanups, what motivates them to work in these areas, and how state and federal agencies can garner their support and their collaboration. So I'm going to introduce both speakers now. You can decide which order you want to speak in and engage in. The first is Tim O'Brien. Tim is a policy director for the Blue Economy Center. Now, that's a 501c3 organization which leads collaborative innovation and sustainable solutions in the water sector, and the principal of TOB Consulting, which offers consulting services for environmental, legal, and general business matters. Previously, Mr. O'Brien worked at Ford Motor Company for 35 years, principally in legal and management positions in the environmental area. Thanks for joining us today, Tom. And also John Morris, who is Honeywell Corporation's Remediation Director, responsible for the cleanup and redevelopment of legacy sites where historical manufacturing resulted in soil, sediment, and groundwater impacts. He leads a multidisciplinary teams in developing long-term strategies for these legacy sites. In New York, I can attest we've had a very good working relationship with Honeywell. And he has been very engaged in Great Lakes legacy projects as well as in major brownfield redevelopment. Thank you very much for joining us. Please welcome our next panel.
Well, thank you. I will start. Tim O'Brien. You can tell us apart. I'm the retired guy. I no longer own ties. John's still working for a living. As indicated, the Blue Economy Center is a not-for-profit organization here located in Detroit. My business partner, Jay Richardson, is with me today, and in the interest of full disclosure, we actually have a ringer on your panel. Helen Taylor is a member of our board of directors. We are focused on sustainable water development in policy, technology, and business. Just very quickly to get us back on schedule here, these are the principal services that the Blue Economy Center provides. The one that I think is most relevant to this is our ability to structure collaborative efforts at approaches to challenging environmental issues. Now, I thought where I'd start today is to give you a sense from a corporate perspective, and as you heard, I spent most of my time at Ford Motor Company, so I had a lot of these conversations with how a Glencoe conversation may initially sound to somebody in the private sector, and why initially you may struggle a little bit with the kind of engagement and collaboration that you're seeking. As I walked in here today and found that I had public television taping, I'm glad that I didn't fully spell out all the words here. So the conversation goes something like this from a corporate perspective. Hi, I'm from the EPA. Thought, response, oh shucks. Next comment, I'm here to help. Oh shucks. Now we're really in trouble, right? Well, this is Glenpoe calling. What's Glenpoe? Isn't that the good witch in The Wizard of Oz? No, Glenpoe, we're working on an area of concern near you. Well, you must be mistaken. There are no areas of concern around here. Actually, to settle on this point for just a minute, when we were first engaged on the Lower Rouge project, we're trying to pull together a collaboration of several major corporations and municipalities. One of my earliest reports to the Glenpoe office after our first round of conversations with the companies and municipalities that we seek to engage was that the good news is that none of them have ever had a discharge of any concern in the Lower Rouge River. So that was the first statement. Having said that, usually the next pitch is, but you know what you need to know is the Legacy Act pays up to 65% of the remediation cost. Now, to those of you in the government sector, and certainly I think that's an important thing, but I must tell you that again, the initial reaction, oftentimes in the private and public sector, was, well, let me see if I understand the math. Isn't 65% of something, which is where this is headed, still more than zero, which is where they are? So 65%, while we think it's a compelling argument, may not be met initially with all the warmth that you are anticipating. And finally, well, will you at least give this some thought and call us back? And I can assure you that what you will hear is absolutely, and what they are thinking is absolutely not. I hope I never get another one of these calls, and maybe they'll go away and go somewhere else. Sort of the moral of this story, as you approach it, is I think it's the first piece of advice I would give you is that private corporations, and I'll speak mostly of that, even though in our instance we're working also with some significant municipal groups. Private corporations want to do the right thing environmentally. I think the significant point at which the interests of the regulatory community and the public policy community diverge is that ultimately the private sector folks have to take account of the economic analysis that is implicit in any of these decisions. And I think it's important for the folks on the government side to understand that they're typically coming from an agenda that is, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way in any way, but is more or less one-dimensional. We have, I'll speak as if I'm part of that at this point in time, we have an agenda to clean up areas of concern in the Great Lakes. We have a purpose to foster economic development and quality of life in the Great Lakes region. Corporations have those interests and purposes as well, but they have to balance it against an economic, and I think that's the number one issue that you need to bridge in your conversations with the private sector. So those are sort of the initial conversations. Now you could walk away from that series of initial conversations with a pretty glum perspective, but I think there are some important opportunities that can change the nature of this. First, our first learning of ours is that I think the private and municipal sector are much more willing to engage with regulatory authorities, in this case EPA, if they can do so through an intermediary, a neutral third party. Frankly, I think this gives them some sense of, a little bit of sense of separation as the collaboration initiates. You know, it's like any other relationship. I think initially folks go into it maybe hesitantly, maybe positively, but having that third party in place to be sort of an interpreter and a conduit we found to be very productive. Now in the Lower Rouge, which is a specific example that we're working with, we were very fortunate. There was an existing entity in place that had been in place for a long time with many of the purposes that Glenpoe had, and it had as its members many of the private sector folks that we're now working with, and that's the Rouge Gateway Partnership, the Rouge River Gateway Partnership. This partnership, it doesn't exist as a legal entity, but is an association of the major corporations and municipalities in the Lower Rouge watershed. It's been in existence for 10 or 15 years now, and its express purposes are to foster economic development and environmental improvement in the Lower Rouge. They have had a vision, a specific vision of actions that they'd like to see take place, and they have been executing that vision over a period of years. So we were fortunate here that we had that third-party intermediary. Folks were comfortable with this intermediary, they were comfortable with its mission, and they had had successful experiences implementing that vision. The second point that I can't emphasize enough is I would strongly encourage you, as you talk with the private sector folks, to consider the economic and community interests, not just the environmental interests. I really don't know of anyone, as I said before, in the private sector today who does not have a positive environmental agenda. But that alone, if they perceive that there are competing economic and community issues, may not be enough to get you over the hump. Community issues, I think, are very significant and undervalued. Local community activists can garner a very high level, a very disproportionate level of attention in corporate, private sector decision-making processes. That can be a negative or that can be a positive. I would encourage you to engage them and make it a positive. Private sector corporations are very responsive to local community interests, and those can be anything from local political folks to local activist groups. Again, in this particular region, we have the benefit of a long-standing public advocacy group in the Lower Rouge, the Friends of the Rouge. Once again, many of these entities, private sector companies that we're working with and municipalities are part of the Friends of the Rouge. They support it, so they go into it with a predisposition that this is a group we're comfortable with, they have an agenda we're comfortable with, we've had positive experiences with them. The third point that I would make is that consider innovation as something that might attract the private sector folks to cleanups of this nature. We all know traditionally the approach to sediment remediation is what we used to call it forward hog and haul. So dig it up and bury it in a landfill somewhere. I would argue that depending on whether you live near the landfill, may not even really constitute remediation. But I am certain that most in the private sector find that in some cases, not all cases, they believe it to be unduly expensive and not environmentally the best choice. So I think being open-minded as you go into a potential area of concern as to what might be viable options to remediation without committing to those will garner significantly more engagement from the private sector folks. And one of the reasons that it will, as you look at the companies that we're working with, companies like Honeywell, U.S. Steel, Ford Motor Company, and on, these folks have similar conditions in other places throughout the Great Lakes and throughout the world. And I think if they can establish an innovative alternative that is environmentally acceptable and financially superior to traditional approaches, that is a significant value to them as they look at other areas of concern. And the last point that I'd want to make is that patience is a virtue, and definitely plan on being virtuous, and by that I mean patient. We've been very fortunate here to have Rose Ellison in the local office working with us here, particularly when you're trying to work with a large group of private and municipal sector folks. It is the proverbial herding of the cats experience. I take you back to that, as opposed to a cleanup, which I'm sure is complex, but a cleanup with a single private party entity, like probably the Honeywell example we'll hear in a minute, just doesn't present the complexities of all the different corporate and municipal cultures and personalities that you have when you try to put together the larger group. And my suspicion is that in most places, when we're talking about legacy pollution, and that's really what we've got in the Lower Rouge watershed at this point, largely is legacy and to some extent municipal. You're going to have to be talking to more than one entity. You're going to be talking to multiple entities, and I take you back to that hypothetical conversation. That conversation almost literally was had by me about 12 or 15 times in this instance. And getting each company or municipality through that stage of denial, if you will, or hoping that this will go away, is a different conversation in each instance. So the takeaways that the most important takeaway that I'd like to leave you with here is, as you address AOCs in other areas, I think you'll get a much greater success rate if you find an intermediary to advocate on your behalf and have the patience and fortitude to sort of stay in the background as EPA or state regulators. Obviously, it's your agenda. You need to drive it, but I assure you, you will get much better results if you aren't the person that they're in conversation with. And it's not a negative, it's just a reality. I think the reality, you need to understand, comes from the fact that particularly in this area, the Great Lakes Legacy Act is a relatively new initiative in environmental terms. Most of these corporations have had a 30 to 40-year experience with environmental regulatory agencies, and it has been traditional enforcement experience, the aw shucks experience that I was describing before. That has built up, I think, in the psyche of a lot of the folks in the private sector, a sense that that is the experience they're going to have when they hear from the GLNPO office. Even though the message from GLNPO is a very different one, it is not the one they're hearing. They're immediately evoking in their minds the 30 years of experience they've had with traditional enforcement actions. That's why you need to be patient. You need to break down that expectation and constantly repeat your message so that they're hearing this is not the 1970s or 1980s enforcement experience that we would traditionally experience. Lastly, just a brief advertorial for the Blue Economy Center. Jay and I, as you look for people, whether it's Jay and I think the skill sets that you're looking for, you need two different skill sets. Jay had his working experience in the manufacturing and engineering community at Ford Motor Company. Obviously, you need to have someone to do this for you with a strong technical background. I think you also need somebody with a public policy and a political background, because ultimately getting through these organizations requires that. So as you look for those intermediaries and those intermediary organizations, those are the skill sets that I would be looking for. So thank you. John, I'll turn it over to you.
While they're loading my presentation, I will say it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you all very much for the opportunity to present some information that I hope will be useful about Honeywell's experiences with waterfront development and our experiences with GLNPO, and where we're actively engaged in AOC cleanup through the Great Lakes. Honeywell does have a very aggressive remediation program. When I started with the company almost 8 years ago, we were spending about $60 million a year on remediation. Last 3 years, we have averaged $280 million a year, and that number is projected to be at the $300 million level for the next 5 years. So the corporation has decided that it is much better to step up and get things done than it is to continue to delay them. Hence, our interest in the GLNPO or the GLLA program, because we think it is a fabulous program. We're engaged in a great deal in the Buffalo River, in the Rouge River, and we did the Ottawa River. So we very much like this program. We push it with other industries. And tying into Tim's experience with his little conversation, which I got a kick out of, we actually had that conversation with others, because although Tim said Honeywell was going it alone, and he was referring to the Buffalo River project, where we are the only industrial non-federal sponsor in the group, we're not the only PRP in the Buffalo River, as you might guess. And so we are out there talking to other PRPs in the river, trying to convince them why it is good for them to join with us as that project goes forward, that they should be engaged in the GLA approach to the river and not wait for a Superfund because of the advantages that this program offers us. Advantages such as fundamental fairness. It recognizes that those industries that survive are here and have money to pay for the cleanup shouldn't be shouldering it all. The federal government's willing to put 50% of that money in there. Alignment of objectives, that you're with a regulator, but somebody who has paying half the fare at least. And it's amazing how objectives get aligned much easier when you're both putting money into the pot. It's just the way it works. And so decisions that come up on, do we dredge here, do we cap here, how do we handle this, it's made from a sense of we're in this together. This is a cooperative approach. We have a problem to solve. We're both putting money into it. Let's go forward and do that. So it's just a totally different approach than under circa, which of course, we're all used to all in the private sector. So it's a breath of fresh air, and I can't speak highly enough about the program. Now, I'm going to move quickly through the slides that I have. I just wanted that little introduction because what I did put together was some examples of where we have redeveloped along waterways. Not all of them in the Great Lakes area, half of them outside, half of them in. So 2 in, 2 out. But I think what it gives you is a sense of if you get the right partner engaged, if you approach this with a cooperative attitude, that you can revitalize these communities. And yes, cleaning up those rivers is a part of it. Stopping the sources to the river to begin with, and then dealing with legacy sediment issues is an important part of it. But you can move forward now if you have the right approach. And so I'll move quickly through this because I want to leave time for questions. The first project that I'll present is the Inner Harbor, where our predecessor company, Honeywell, for those of you who don't know, is the combination, the Honeywell name is the combination of the old Honeywell Corporation that was bought in 2000 by Allied Signal, which has a legacy of Allied Chemical. So we go way back into the 1860s and 1880s with manufacturing of chemicals, and hence our legacy. People generally think of, hey, don't you guys think those little round thermostats? What are you doing with any remediation problems? But we were and continue to be a major chemical producer. And what you see up on the screen here is our Inner Harbor chrome plant. Operated from the 30s to the 80s. That's it on the lower right there. And we closed that in the 80s, and that is part of an active redevelopment right now, which I'll take you through. This is a shot of that same area as the, you can't see it here, but around it, fully enclosing there, is a slurry wall that protects, in this case, the Patapsco River from contaminants from the site, and it is a fully capped site. And that cap has been integrated into the redevelopment concept, which I will show you here. This is a rendering, so not all these buildings are built yet, but this has been fully approved, entitled, and a developer on board, and the work is underway. And you do notice that there's a tremendous amount of green space. As part of the agreement with both the city and the developer, we're keeping a significant part of the site open for green space and a walkway all around it to join up with the rest of the Inner Harbor Walkway. One of the buildings, the Morgan Stanley building, has been built. This is the first building on the site. So this is an ongoing, viable redevelopment project. And what are the keys to success on this one? Well, I do have to start with location. That is one beautiful piece of property sitting there right almost in the water as a peninsula right off Fells Point. So it is a valuable piece of property. But we had quite a bit of support from EPA and the Maryland Department of the Environment to get this project done. The consent order that we negotiated incorporated protocols for agency approvals of the redevelopment in staged phases. Why that's important is because then that makes it much easier for the redeveloper to know what he has to go through. He has a sense of certainty and financial risk bracketing, essentially, that he knows if he follows this roadmap, he's going to get his development through. Very important for the economic side of this project. Stronger outreach in the community. And in the case of Baltimore, they had 2 tools that make it very attractive for the developer: a planned urban design program, which is essentially for areas in need of redevelopment. They have specific standards and things to be met, and they offer tax increment financing for, I'm not going to go into that, for those of you who know it, that's important for redevelopment in a lot of different areas. I'm going to move on to a second outside of the Great Lakes project that I have here, which is what we call Bayfront. This is on the Hackensack River. You see it there. It's 100 acres right where the Hackensack River meets the Passaic River and forming Newark Bay. New York City just off to the right on that screen. It's 100 acres. It was former industrial and municipal use. What you see on the top part of that screen, let me see if I can, this won't carry far enough probably, but that's the municipal complex, and this was all industrial at one time. And we have put together and fully entitled a redevelopment of that 100 acres in a way that coordinates the remediation of the site with the redevelopment. The green areas that are shown through the development here are actually areas that are capped. We excavated a portion of the site and are capping a portion of the site. and that makes it more economically viable for a redevelopment. This is a major redevelopment on the west side of Jersey City. This is 8,000 planned residential units. It is a fully sustainable community. The green you see in the buildings are all green roofs. Every street has a bike path. It is served by the extension of the transit system down here on the right. That is a transit station, which I will show you, but the transit line is extended from its current terminus to serve this community. It's been all through City Council and approved. There's a look at the rendering again, but it is a major high-density development that will be it will add to the vibrancy of this west side of Jersey City. On the water side, we've also incorporated a few things here of interest: a walkway that cuts across the minor cove, connecting an existing development with this new one, and a walkway along the Hackensack River itself. The keys to success on this one was we were in litigation with Jersey City, and rather continue to fight, we joined with them. We partnered with them and said, why don't you sell us your 35 acres? We'll put it together into a major redevelopment. We'll settle our litigation and move forward together as partners, and we are a partner with Jersey City in this redevelopment. It's consistent with the master plan. In the case of New Jersey, they have a formal program called Area in Need of Redevelopment, which makes it easier to acquire property and easier to get the financing for the redevelopment. This community, as I said, is a creative live, work, and play. It is designed with very high density for residential, very low parking space. The parking is extremely low. It forces people to use mass transit and other areas of public transportation. Now, moving to the Great Lakes region, we are actively working on a site that we call Detroit Tar. It's along the Detroit River. There's a picture of it as it operated really in the early 20th century, a major chemical and tar complex supporting the steel mills that were in this area. Here it is today, actually, or a few years ago. It has been cleaned up to a large extent, and it is actively in use. This is an example of a site we have taken from industrial use to industrial use. So it has a deep water port. It has a lot of economic value as an industrial site. That's what the remediation did, and that's what's on there now. There's just a few pictures that I have, because this looks like just a nice setting for a small industry, but underneath here is the groundwater collection trench and the remediation equipment that's necessary to protect the Detroit River from the legacy use of the previous use of the site. The deep water port right along the Lafarge operations. So the keys to success in Detroit were that the city's master plan here said, we want these industries out of downtown. Where can we put them? This site offered a great opportunity. So we had the advantage of the city wanting to relocate industries. And so we were able to, one, clean it up to industrial use, and two, have tenants essentially brought to our door, which made it much easier. And the reuse, we were able to integrate those industries into the property while the remediation was ongoing in a way that didn't interfere with it. And as I mentioned, the deep water port is a key. The last project that I'll just go over is in Buffalo. It's the former Buffalo Color site. Here is a picture of the Buffalo River, and in the yellow there, the Buffalo Color site. The Buffalo River is, as I mentioned earlier, an AOC, 6.2 miles of it, essentially from the confluence right here of the two creeks that form it, all the way down to Lake Erie, is an area of concern. We have finished the RI and an FS for that area of concern and are in design right now. We hope to sign a project agreement with Great Lakes National Program Office in the first part of next year and be out dredging in 2012. They are currently dredging under GLLI money right now. The Army Corps is jump-starting the process, and it's generated a lot of excitement in the Buffalo area that this river is finally going to get cleaned up. There is a brownfields opportunity area for this river that's going to build on that excitement and look at creative industrial and recreational use of that river, keying again on the cleanup of the river, which includes significant habitat improvement. Not only are the sediments being taken out that represent a risk to the benthic community, but there is planned in a range of $10 million worth of habitat improvements in the river just through this program. So let me just quickly go through so I can leave some time for questions. Again, this is what it looked like in 1940. And when I show this picture, I do get a kick out of this. If you look close, and I know it's hard from where you're sitting at, you will find there's virtually no parking. In that day, you did not drive your car to work. There's almost no parking there. You walked to a large extent. The community around it was where many of the workers lived, and or you took bus or other public transportation. And hopefully we're moving back into that. As I mentioned, with the live, work, play concept that we're pushing in that Hackensack redevelopment, we're trying to get back to reliance on public transportation as a means of getting around. But this picture does speak wonders about the density of the chemical production there and the lack of any other facilities nearby. Here's the vision that we rolled out to the public as to what this site could look like in its redeveloped state. We ultimately found a developer who took it in a slightly different direction, which I'll show you, but establishing a vision for what the property can be goes a long way to getting the kind of support from electeds and community officials that make these projects successful. And what we really ended up with was a rail museum. There's the Western New York Historical Rail Society that has signed a long-term lease for the property and are building, you see here the roundhouse and trackage, but they're building a major train museum and a steel museum on the site, and they're partnering with the Steel Association. And it's a great use of the property, and the mayor and the council and the community is very, very happy with this use of the site. They are already moving forward. We had a kickoff. Here's a little pictures I threw in here. They brought their one of their vintage engines to the Brownfields kickoff, where we started the demolition of the facility and turning it into use that they can take advantage of. There's a tremendous amount of trackage there. If I could have gone back and showed you on that other picture, but that really helps their use of the site. There's a train museum where, on the right-hand side, that is the adaptive reuse of just a fabulous old boiler house that we did not tear down, that we left up, and they are going to integrate that into their train museum with in a wonderful design, at least in this rendering. Hopefully it goes to fruition, but it's really a great use of a huge old structure that we hated to tear down, and it was nice to be able to find a site user who could make use of that building. Keys to success with Buffalo Color reuse is that New York State has a very strong brownfields program, and we entered that brownfields program in unison with the property developer that we teamed with. The availability of the property, we bought it at tax sale, or our developer bought it at tax sale, so that's all obviously a key. The agency, the DEC in particular, encouraged this development. The individual that we teamed with had good local connections. Essentially, he brought the train museum operation to us and said, I think this will work for our site. You all have responsible for the remediation. Does this align with what you would like to see for the site? And we studied it, we met with them, and we agreed that this was a fabulous use of the site. And when we got them on board, the Western New York Historical Rail Society, they are very passionate about their operation, and they went with us to the elected officials, to the community, and presented what they would like to do with the site. And it's just very nice to have people who feel that strongly about what they can do for a community. It makes our job, industry, who's, shall we say, not always thought of in that light in the community, it makes our job easier to sell an idea that is good overall for the community. So that's the 4 examples I brought to show, 2 outside the region, but I think we can learn from them, 2 within the region, and I reiterate Honeywell's commitment to this program and think it's fabulous. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I got to tell you, the interest in the Buffalo River is unbelievable. And when a river that's been hit like that over the years is taken from what it was to basically a centerpiece for community renewal and revitalization, it makes you feel hopeful that you can do almost anything. And I just got to acknowledge Colonel Bales of the Army Corps District, heads the Army Corps District Office out of Buffalo. Fantastic assistance on that. The Army Corps is out there doing this and setting the stage for the next phase. And then we're going to get after that CSO. We're going to build parks along the side of it. It's going to be fantastic. And we'll put a plaque up to Colonel Bales a little bit later.
If I might add, I know I took more than my share of time, but the partners in there, I should have recognized them. We are working with Army Corps. It's been fabulous to work with. The Buffalo Niagara River Keeper has been instrumental in keeping the parties aligned and doing a great job of pushing this project forward. The DEC has been very, very valuable in this whole exercise, and of course Glenpoe and EPA Region 2.
Well, thank you very much. Now, we do have time for a few questions from the commissioners for our panel, and we're hoping to start our next session in about 2 or 3 minutes. So if anybody has anything in particular they wanted to raise, but it was a very good presentation, very useful, Frank. Any question? Well, you gave us all the information we could need. Thank you so much.
Thank you.